in the Scriptures. Let me turn this on to make sure. One of the most confusing things in the Scriptures is the law. But let's see what the Bible has to say about it. In the New Testament, I gotta change this up here. In the New Testament, we see that, first of all, Matthew 7:12 says, "So in everything you do to others, do what you want to have them do to you, for that sums up the law and the prophets." Another says, "After reading from the law and the prophets, the leaders of the synagogue sent word to them saying, 'Brothers, if you have a word of exhortation for the people, please speak.'" So you're seeing already today in the New Testament, they talk about the law and the prophets very specifically. And Jesus said, he said to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses," which is the law, "the prophets, and the Psalms." So the law and the prophets pretty much make up almost the whole entire Old Testament, those two things. The law and the prophets make up the whole entire Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, seeing the law and the prophets together was somewhat of a new idea, though. Because in the Old Testament, the law was pretty much the whole entire thing. Everything was based upon the law. It was until the 6th century. Now, to help you understand what that means, is that in the 6th century, that was about 590. And remember, they got into the land at about 1400. So we're talking 900 years later, they finally start talking about this. Well, and the reason is, I'll tell you, one of the big reasons is because just kind of like with the New Testament, we think that they had the Bible with them in the New Testament. Well, they didn't. It was being written. And the Bible did not come about for another 350 years after the New Testament was written. And the same with this. The prophets, it took a little while for the prophets to start coming out. So we see in Jeremiah, which is around 590, it says, "Come, let us make plans against Jeremiah, for teachings of the law by the priests will not cease, nor will counsel up from the wise, nor word from the prophets." And let me just say one more thing before we start. I want to apologize. I didn't even pray. Forgive me. I'm doing a teacher thing. I'm just like, yeah, get going. Sorry about that. I apologize. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this. And we just want to commit this to you because, Father, I don't want to forget that this is your word. It's not mine. And, Father, that everything you do, Father, is for us, to give us life, and life abundantly, you said. Father, please bless your word, and please help us to understand what you want us to see. In Jesus' name. Thanks, guys. In Zechariah. Now, Zechariah was written about 520 BC. They made their hearts as hard as flint. They would not listen to the law or the word of the Lord Almighty had sent by his Spirit through the earlier prophets. So we see that God really spoke to them in two different ways. So let's look at the prophets. So most of the Old Testament is about the prophets. The majority of it, actually. So excluding the first 5 books, also excluding Psalms, books of Solomon. If you're wondering what the books of Solomon, that would be Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Proverbs. Those are the books of Solomon. Esther, Job, and Ruth. Now, the Jews see Ruth as, they actually have one of their laws out of Ruth. But I don't know if I really say it's prophetic or not. Who knows? But the key is, what I'm getting is that God speaks to us. This is one of the most fundamental facts of Christianity, that God speaks to us. In the Old Testament, God spoke to them in the law, but he spoke to them from the mountain. He spoke to them through prophets. God continually talks to us. Now, and this is what truly sets us apart from other religions, is that our God reaches out to us. He talks to us. His Holy Spirit lives in us. That is a very important thing. And even in the Old Testament, God continued to reach out to them. Remember, in Islam, God doesn't talk to you in Islam. Islam has 1 billion followers, but God doesn't talk to them. God just wants them to do a bunch of stuff, and that's it. You're on your own. He continued to speak them through the prophets. And as we see in Hebrews, it says, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. So I really want you guys to understand that God speaks to us. The whole entire Old Testament, God spoke to them. God continually sent people to talk to them. And that is the most phenomenal thing about Christianity. So what is the law? Well, this is kind of how the Jews see it. They actually, this is the newer book written, and it's called the Mitzvot 613. Now, that means there are 600, to the Jews, there are 613 different laws. They compiled them. Now, I'll tell you, if you read it, I actually read it, and it was interesting. There was a lot of do this, and it was kind of like some of it was redundant. Kind of was like God says do this, and God says don't do this. Those are two different laws, but it's the same, kind of the same thing. But the interesting thing is that they believe God gave them 613, and you know these very staunch Jews today, they're trying to follow all 613. That's amazing. 613? Well, but wait a minute. Jesus only gave us 2. In a sense. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Those are what Jesus gave us. But you know what? That was found in the Old Testament. Let's look at it. In Deuteronomy, hear, O Israel, be careful to obey so that it may go well with you and you're greatly increasing the land, flowing with milk and honey. This is the second thing I really want to impress to everybody. We see God as this ogre of do's and don'ts. God is a do and don't God. Do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. We forget. So that it may go well with you. Now, I'm going to encourage you all to do a study this week. To go into Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and look up how many times God says, if you do these things, this good thing will happen to you. God continually tells us, if we follow His word, good things will happen over and over. I'm not talking health and wealth gospel here, guys. I'm not saying, brother, if you just give me $50,000 so I can buy my brand new car for the ministry, I will bless you. No, that's not at all what I'm saying. What God says over and over, though, is He says, if you're careful to obey me, then good things will happen to you. I promise you, really should go in and read how many times, because God is not here just to say, all right, kid, do this, don't do that. And let me tell you what also God does. He almost always explains why. Kids are like, but why? God always talks to you about why He does something. Now, is this a God that's an ogre? We think the Old Testament God is mean and killing people, and in the prophets you're going to find that they're just, well, let me tell you, when we get to the prophets, I think you're going to see something a little differently. Because when you start seeing God pouring out His heart to them, saying, if you would have just obeyed me, you wouldn't be in this situation. God says to the people in the prophets over and over. This is a loving God. Not one who is an ogre who wants you to do all these things for you, for Him. Do this, do that. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Now, by the way, hear, O Israel, in the Hebrew, actually, obey and hear, O Israel, kind of go hand in hand. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These commandments I give you today are to be on your hearts and impress them on your children. Amazing. Raising kids up in the way of the Lord. God cares about you, and He cares about your kids. So let's talk about the second commandment. When you reap the harvest of the land, do not reap to the very edges of the field. Gather the gleanings of the harvest. Do not go over and pick the vineyard a second time or pick up grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. God cares about people. So basically, and we see this in Ruth. In the book of Ruth, we see that that's what they did. They went back and went back. You take the field, you go through and you pick your stuff. Whatever's left, you're not to go back and do it again because the foreigner and the poor will go back and take theirs. God really cares. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not deceive one another. Let's keep going. Do not swear falsely by my name or profane the name of God. Do not defraud or rob your neighbor. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind. Wow. Yes, ma'am. Sure.
Okay. You refer to we only have two laws, two to-dos, but yet we have the Ten Commandments. We have all of these listed. So how do you say that these are not technically laws when you said that there's only two?
Well, Jesus said the two commandments, the most important commandments, are love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. And what he said was, everything is within that. Now, and what I'm going through, just give me just a minute and we're going to get to that in the end. Yeah, I promise we will get to that, I promise. I'm kind of showing kind of a progression here. I promise. Oh, you're doing great. No, I don't mind the questions at all. Good job. Do not pervert justice or show partiality to the poor. God cares about the poor. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not do anything that would endanger your neighbor's life. Do not hate a fellow Israelite. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge, but love your neighbor as yourself. So what Jesus was saying, and that's kind of what I said, he gave us two, but the thing is, what Jesus was saying is everything is within these two commandments. All of this stuff. If you love your neighbor as yourself, if you treat every single person as you want to be treated, then all of this stuff will come naturally, should come to you. Now, granted, in the book, Paul actually goes through all this stuff again, and I hope that helps. So the idea, Jesus is basically saying, your heart should be two things. Two things should come out of you. First, in your heart, there should be a love for God, first and foremost. And secondly, everything you do should be for the benefit of your neighbor. And it's interesting, I love what the Didache says. That's that early Christian writing. It says, if you do these things, then you will not have an enemy. And actually, I've been thinking about, I thought that a lot, and I've been doing it at my job and my second job, and I've been finding that I'm purposely being nice to people, I'm purposely doing things, and people respond a lot nicer back to me. So all of these things, Jesus said, when they asked him, what are the greatest? All of them are based upon this. If we are treating others the way we want to be treated, and I always think, oh, should I follow them really close? Well, would I want them to do that to me? Should I cut someone off? Would I want them to do that to me? Now, granted, I'm not saying, a lot of times cannot be a very nice guy, okay? And I know I really wish I was. I really wish I was. You know, it's kind of like Psalm 119. It says, if only I would have followed your laws and did what they said. You know, the thing is, then this stuff would come. But this is the desire of our hearts as a Christian, should be to love God and to love our neighbor. And that's why Jesus said those are the two greatest commandments. So in a sense, he did only give us two, in a sense. And if you can keep those two, if you don't remember all the other ones, you can keep those two in mind, things will go well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, just a little, when you talk about the mitzvah with 600...
Right, now that's the Jews who put that together afterwards.
Jewish, but are they not maybe in their document just individualizing each one of the laws, whereas here we're not individualizing, although some of the laws are the same, we're just combining them into
Right.
two concepts.
So the key is, and the whole idea is kind of the idea of how Jesus wanted us to see things. He, number one, wanted it to be simple. He didn't want it to be this. 613 is crazy. And I tell you, if you just want to look at it, go online and read what the 16th mitzvah says. The lists are huge. And I don't think that was ever God's idea. Because remember what Jesus did. Remember when Jesus used to get mad at people? He wouldn't get mad at the prostitute. He wouldn't get mad at the tax collector, the drug abuser, people or anything, people who may have had an abortion or whatever. He's not going to get mad at them. He got mad at the Jewish leaders because what they would do is he said they would put heavy yokes on them. A yoke is where oxen, there's this big wooden thing that actually goes between two oxen, and it's really heavy on there, and they led and do their fields that way. That's a yoke. And so Jesus says, my yoke is easy. He wants to keep it simple. Help you to remember that. So, does that help?
Yes.
Perfect. No problem at all. Glad to help. All right, so the two things that God wants us to do, but there's a lot in here. And I also wanted you guys to see that everything that we read in the New Testament really is found in the Old Testament because they agree. Love is patient, love is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not boast. It's not proud. It does not dishonor others or self-seeking. Wait a minute. Isn't that what we just read here? Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. It always protects. It always trusts. It always hopes. It always preserves. I think Paul was reading from the law when he wrote this. It's amazing that, again, this God who we think was mean, awful, nasty, and rotten, that's not at all what he is. He's loving. He's kind. And if we follow him, and we do what he says, he will take care of us. So what is the law? Well, the law is found in Genesis through Deuteronomy. Mostly Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it's commonly known as the Pentateuch. But it was given, and why was it given? It was given a promise to Abraham first and foremost. Why was the law given? It was given to Abraham. As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. See, that the key is that God told him this. And we will see here in a little bit that God fulfilled it and made his promise and did what he says. God always says, I am not a man that I should lie. Wow, ouch. But God, very specific. So let's talk about it. And by the way, Charlton Heston here is parting the Red Sea. So let's talk about that. What did God really say to them? Well, here's the story. God met Abraham. Abraham did what God wanted him to do. God gave him a son when he was 90 years old. That son, his name is Isaac. Isaac had Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. This is the extremely abridged version. This is like the little pamphlet instead of the big thing. So he had 12 sons, and one of the days early on, some of the sons took one of the brothers down, Joseph down, and threw him in a pit to kill him. But then he said, no, we're not going to. We're going to sell him into slavery. We'll make some money off Joseph. They didn't like him. So, I'm sorry? Sorry, okay. So took money off Joseph. All right, so Joseph was there, and so what God did is God used Joseph to actually help them. Because God rose him up in the system. Actually, he became second to Pharaoh. Remember last when we were talking about the lands of the Old Testament? There's actually parts in Egypt named after him today because of that. Remember we talked about the lands of the Old Testament. So from there, God raised him up, and he saved Jacob and his sons, brought them down, saved them after that. Well, unfortunately, another Pharaoh rose up who did not know him, and they began to oppress the Israelites and say, hey, we need a new pyramid built. Guess who's going to build that next pyramid? I think it's going to be you guys. So they built the pyramid. So 430 years after they got there, God sent Moses. Actually trained Moses up 40 years prior to that. Trained Moses 40 years. Then he sent Moses back down there. And from there, he actually helped save them. We got the plagues. God did everything to save them. God delivered them from the Egyptians. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because it's extremely important to understand that the law was written for two different reasons. First of all, much of the Old Testament is based on the law. It's the backbone of Judaism. Some of the laws from what we're talking about are based on Hammurabi's, but it's Moses' law. And some of our medical practices are based on the law. The law is called the Torah in Hebrew, or the Pentateuch in Greek. Remember in 250 BC, the Old Testament was written in Greek, and so all of the early church fathers, that's all they used was Greek. And so we learned, that's what we call it, the Pentateuch. But the law was given for two reasons. Number one, it was given them to help them learn to live in a new land. God took them in slavery in Egypt. They were there, and God said, I'm taking you and sending you somewhere else. They did not know how to take care of themselves. How could they? They were under the yoke of slavery. They had to learn everything. So when you read the law, when you read this stuff, you have to understand that a lot of it was given to train them how to hold court, how to treat each other, how to take care of foreigners, how to take care of their fields, God talks about, how to deal with medicine. But there's one other thing that God also did, and that will help us to understand parts of the law that we kind of look at kind of crazily. The second part was, it was given to them to remain separate from the people. Because when God sent them in that land, everywhere the place they were at, none of them were Christians, or I should say Jews. They were not good people. Deuteronomy 7:6 says, you are a holy people of your God. The Lord God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. God wanted to set them apart, them to be different. Why? And Deuteronomy also says this, when you enter the land God's giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their sons and daughters on the fire. Don't kill your kids in the name of God. Who practice divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, casts spells, who is a medium or spiritualist, who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord, because these things are the same detestable practices that the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. Basically, the nations were terrible. Remember we talked about polytheism? That's why I taught that first, to help you to understand when they were in there, they were serving Baal, they were serving Ashereth, they were serving all these different gods. And there was sexual practices, a lot of weird stuff. There was extreme homosexuality going on, bestiality. If you're wondering why God dedicates almost a whole chapter to sex, that's the reason why. Why did God tell them not to eat certain things? Because those people, that's what they eat. They ate. God said, I don't want you to be like that. I want you to do this. So if you're wondering why he gave them the dietary laws, well, number one, eating camel is probably not a good idea. Anyway, I don't know, I never tried camel, but I'm sure it wouldn't be that great. But the thing is, but the key is also is that that's what they did. And he said, I don't want you to be like that. God had a plan for them. God had a desire for them. God had things he wanted them to do and to be separate. And he said, if you obey me, things will go well with you. So when you read the law, you've got to understand that that's the two things God is desiring. So when you read funky, weird stuff about, eating this and eating grasshoppers, but don't eat these fish, that's what he's getting at, is that whole thing. And it's interesting because, do you ever wondered why, if you think about it, if you ever wondered why in the New Testament God got rid of that stuff? If you think about it just for a second, it may make sense. Because if God brings them into Canaan, those are the things those people around them were eating. If God took them to South America, they would be eating completely different things. So why do you think God got rid of the dietary laws? Well, one of the things is there's no how can you tell people who live anywhere in the world what they can? I mean, you'd have to make dietary laws for everybody because there's different things everywhere. So so it's no wonder God got rid of that. These were very specifically for them in that region because, you don't have to worry about eating camel when you come to the United States. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I had to avoid 3 of them when I came over here today. I'm just kidding. No, there's no camels out there. I mean, seriously, think about it. Why did God do that? That was smart. God's like, you don't have to do this anymore because they're not living in a place that has camels or grasshoppers or this or that. It's very specific to them of the people around them. Okay? So, what if we went to a new land? What would God tell us to be separate from the people? Okay, so let's just pretend that we were under the yoke of the Chinese and that God saved us from the Chinese and he desired to give us, guess where? Canada! Hey, you guys got Canada. Sorry, Canadians. Sorry, all you Canadians up there who live there. So, yes, God gave us Canada. So, now we're going to live in Canada. So, but the problem is we have to live next door to the people in the United States. And Keith and I were just talking about some of the things in the people in the United States earlier. There's some bad stuff. What would God want to teach us for them? Well, I just kind of came up with a few things. First of all, laws about drug use. Yeah. Because in Israel, they really didn't. I don't think they had peyote, and they didn't grow marijuana over there. There was a bunch of stuff they didn't grow. They didn't grow poppies there. So, laws about abortion. Okay. Laws about highly processed food. You mean I can't have McDonald's? That's a joke. Actually, that's a joke. But the thing is, try to avoid processed food because ultimately it's going to kill you off in the end. You'll be, Laws about gays and lesbians, because that's a huge problem now. Laws about transgenderism. Do you know in the Bible, in the law, it says, a man should not dress up like a woman or a woman a man. It is detestable. So God talked about this also there. About child discipline. Not to say you shouldn't discipline your child, just don't beat the crap out of them. So, laws about tattoos and piercing. Well, tattoos are actually banned in the law. Now, I'm not saying if you have tattoos, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with tattoos. But the thing is, a lot of times you see these people with tattoos and piercings, and they look like, you put a magnet near them, they're going to be flying through the air towards the magnet. But the thing is, I just threw these up here. Think about what God would tell us in America, if we lived, he gave us Canada, and for being around the people in the United States. That's the very same thing he did when he went to the people in Israel and put them in there. Again, when you read the law, please understand, it may seem crazy, but it was 2 reasons, because it was how to live in the land and how to be separate from the people surrounding the land. All right, before we go any further, let's look at a basic list of the law from the Torah. This is a basic list. So the 10 Commandments, or the Decalogue. So the Decalogue is the name they actually gave to it. Now, Decalogue, just so you know, is interesting because Decalogue actually has French origins now, because it was actually written in like the Middle Ages. So just so you know, France was the seat of the church for about 70 years. In about 1300. If we go through Christian history, I'll go into all that, where there was actually 3 popes, and there was in the land. It was real weird stuff. But anyway, that's where that comes from. Moral laws, murder, honesty, theft. Social laws on property, inheritance, marriage. Food laws, clean and unclean, we just talked about that. Purity laws, menstruation, seminal emissions. Menstruation, keep that in mind, menstruation, act of bleeding, because when we go through blood, we're going to talk about that. Feasts. Wait a minute, feasts? I thought God didn't want us to party. That's not true. God had 3 major feasts a year that they'd go for about a week. They would party pretty hard for about a week. Now, I'm not saying they're doing meth and everything like that. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is God wanted them to have a good time. Those feasts were a way of them relaxing. God cares about his people. So the Old Testament is not this staunch, nasty, awful stuff that we should get rid of. God cared about his people. Sacrifices and offerings. How God wanted to offer. Because one of the things God also did, and we'll get to this later, is how to get yourself right with him. Instructions of the priesthood. Instructions regarding the tabernacle, the temple, the ark. That goes back to being right with him. And forward instructions looking forward to a king. Now remember, this is interesting because God talks about what to do about a king in Deuteronomy, right? Okay, but how many years after they actually got in the land did they actually get a king? Anybody know? Take a guess. How many years do you think it took him to have a king afterwards? 400. That's about it, actually. Yeah, it's about 400 because it was around, because when Saul came as king, it was about 1,000, and it was like 1,400 when they got into the land. So, good job. All right, laws of the court. To be honest, a lot of our court procedures today are based upon this. Remember we said, not kind of similar to Hammurabi, but ours today are based upon this. How to act in court. How to be on the stand, not to perjure yourself or lie about another. How judges are not to take bribes and judge fairly between the rich and the poor. Ooh, the rich and the poor. We go back to that. That's a big issue to God. The rich were not allowed to continue to get rich and oppress the poor. Okay? Now, one of the things I will say, and I want to really come out, in the church in the Middle Ages, there was a very big push to say, we want everybody to be poor. You need to all give everything up and be poor, become monks. There was a big thing with that. I don't think that was God's idea either. God doesn't want us to be poor, helpless, whatever. But he doesn't say not to be rich. He just talks about being rich has some problems associated with it. But let me tell you, God takes care of the poor. And there is a lot about it in the law. For there will never cease to be poor in your land, therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy, and to the poor of the land. That's not a New Testament idea. God understands some are very good at making money, and others are not. So he never says that being rich is bad. He never says being poor is bad. He never says either one. Like, for instance, my uncle is extremely good. He's a millionaire. He's just so good at it, but he's very selfish with his money. But the thing is, he is very good at it. I am not like him. However, God set various laws concerning the rich and the poor. Laws concerning the poor. If any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, on the 7th year you must set them free. So now in America and in other parts of the world, we see that people, they get destitute and you become kind of almost an indentured servant or whatever under these guys, but you never can let it go. Once you become this, you're never going to go in other parts of the world. But in God's, if these people did that, on the 7th you're to set them free. But what else are you supposed to do with them? Supply them liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, from your winepress. Give them stuff. Give to them as the Lord blessed you. Remember, you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. He didn't just deliver them. What else did the Egyptians? What did the Egyptians do for them when they left? Gave them a lot of stuff, anything they needed. And it's interesting because God used all that stuff to build what? The tabernacle, the ark, the tabernacle. All that stuff was used. So whatever God does, he always does it right. And that's something I like to always remember, because I got to remember that whenever God tells me to do something, it's usually right. If I do the other thing, not a good thing, because God always knows what he wants you to do. All right, more about the poor. Do not charge a fellow Israelite interest. Ouch. Whether on money or food or anything else that may earn interest. Can't do it. At the end of 7 years, you must cancel all debts. Whoa, what if America did that? 7 years? You're out of here, man. Your debts are gone. How is this to be done? Every creditor shall cancel a loan they have made to fellow Israelites. They should not require payment It's amazing. When you make a loan of any kind to your neighbor, do not go into the house to get what is offered. Stay outside. Let the neighbor to whom you are making the loan bring the pledge out to you. Basically, you're not to go and say, oh yeah, you're loaning me your cloak, so I'm walking in, I'm just going to get that and take care of that. That's rude. God's like, no, don't do that. No, let them bring it out to you, because basically they're offering it to you. That's a very nice thing. But if the neighbor is poor, do not go to sleep with their pledge in your possession. So if they give you their cloak, return it by sunset so they can sleep with it. Wow, God really does care about us. Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether the worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing among you. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and they are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry out to the Lord against you. Which brings us into an interesting thing about civil sins. Civil sins are sins against others, but God sees them, when we sin against others, they're sins against Him. So when I treat someone else poorly, God says, you're not just treating them poorly, you're treating me poorly. The law of Moses was different from the other legal codes, because in the Near East, transgressions were seen as offenses against God rather than just against civil law. Meaning that if you do something or whatever to someone else, that's a civil code and you'll have to pay or whatever. But God says, no, it's against me. This contrasts with the Sumerian code. Sumerian, not Sumerian. Sumerian, remember Sumer, the land of Ur, Abraham's town, very big place. Also the Babylonian code of Hammurabi. This is important, and this is something we need to understand about the law. Whatever you do, God says you're doing it to Him. Isn't that what He says? Whatever's done to the least of these, my brethren, you've done to whom? You've done to me. Have you helped them? Have you done things? Whatever you do to me. That was in the New Testament, but look, we see is that it's actually found here. How does God seize it? One of them, an expert for the law, tested him and questioned, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, with your mind. This is the first and greatest. And the second is, love your neighbor as yourself." All the law and the prophets hang on those two commandments. Again, if I always like to say number one and number two. What I think to myself, I want to follow number two. So, be nice to people. Don't say bad things to people. I have to remind myself. As you probably know, I'm not a person that's very, I have a hard time with lots of people. And you always see me like running away because I have a hard time. I got to remind myself to always be nice, to be kind. Even driving in here today, it's like, okay, be nice to people. Make sure you don't say something bad. Don't run them over. Seriously, I do that all the time because you know why? Because of that. The second, I got to remember number two. Number two, be nice. So we got one more slide. Okay. What should be done to atone for our sins against God? And this is what we're going to do this and we'll be done. If any member in the community sins unintentionally, means you didn't mean to, and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands, when they realize their guilt and their sin they have committed becomes known, they must bring an offering for the sin of a female goat without defect. This is for unintentional sins. If you didn't know that you did it, but you found out you did something wrong, God still sees it as something against Him. Now, this is where we're going to end, but I want you to think about this, that God desires a life for a life. And we're going to go into that starting next time about the blood, about sacrifice, of what someone has to pay. Now, I love what Chuck Missler said. This guy I grew up under teaching of. He said that everything we do, whenever we eat, something has to pay for that. An animal, a plant, even when we eat. So there's death all the time for us. God understands. He wants us to understand that, when we are doing things, we may sin against him. But there has to be some kind of payment. Now, we know Jesus did that for us in the end. But this is what we're going to go to next. So, guys, enjoy. Have a great time. Thanks so much. Is there any questions? We got just about 2 minutes. Anything I can answer for you? Okay, guys, next week. Have a good day. Let's see. Let's see. Where are we at?